It's strange how a house can feel like both a sanctuary and a prison. All depending on the circumstances. When I was younger, the house I grew up in seemed to suffocate me. It wasn't the kind of place where you could shut your eyes and feel safe. I've often wondered if it was the walls or the people inside them that made it feel so small. But in the end, it was both. I don't even remember when my mom remarried. I was too young to grasp the weight of what was happening around me. But I do remember the moment he came into our lives. My stepfather, let's call him Paul, wasn't like any of the other dads I saw on TV or in the neighborhood. He wasn't kind in a way that made you feel warm inside. Nor was he harsh in the way you'd expect an abusive father to be. He was just indifferent. At least to me. When he first moved in, it wasn't an official invitation. More like a quiet shift in the landscape. I had my own room at first. Tucked away in the back of the house. Far from their constant bickering. But that didn't matter. I quickly realized my role in the family wasn't to be a daughter, but to be a helper. A maid. A body that could carry out endless tasks without complaint. I didn't know any better back then. My mom was always so busy trying to please him. Trying to make everything work. She didn't have time to notice that I was barely surviving. She didn't see that the man she married treated me like I was invisible when he wasn't demanding something. He didn't love me. He didn't care about me. He just wanted to be taken care of. And if that meant I had to bear the brunt of that care, then so be it. Looking back, I can see now how subtly he wore me down. It wasn't the big things, but the small daily requests. Can you bring me my coffee? Did you finish cleaning the garage? Why isn't dinner on the table yet? Did you fold the laundry properly? Over time, I learned not to argue. I learned to shrink into the background and do whatever was asked of me. Without question. Mom never saw it. I never thought to tell her. She was too busy trying to keep everything afloat. And I didn't want to add to her load. The silence between us grew. I began to resent her for not seeing what was happening to me. But the guilt always crept in. She was just trying to make a life for us. And it seemed like she had forgotten how to see me as anything other than an extension of the house. Another piece of furniture that needed dusting. By the time I was in middle school, I was running the house. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean, I was responsible for everything. Paul would come home from work, sit down in his chair, and demand whatever he needed for the evening dinner. His shoes polished. The TV remote handed to him, as if it were the most urgent task on earth. Meanwhile, I would take care of the laundry, the dishes, and any cleaning that needed to be done. It was almost as if I had been trained for this. No one had to ask me to do it, I simply did it. I suppose that's how people get used to being treated like this. You start doing everything. And eventually, you don't know how to stop. But every day, there was a small voice in the back of my mind that would ask, why is this my job? The problem wasn't just the chores themselves, it was the fact that I wasn't allowed to be a kid. Other kids at school talked about their weekends, their hobbies, their sleepovers. I envied them, wishing I had the luxury of a carefree moment. But my life was nothing like that. I remember when I had to give up my weekends to take care of the house. My friends would call me, asking if I wanted to go to the mall. And I'd have to make excuses. It wasn't just because I couldn't go, it was because my stepdad had demanded that I stay home and clean the garage. Or take care of some other task that only seemed urgent to him. There were moments, tiny cracks in the facade, when I tried to speak up. I remember once asking him if I could skip cleaning the backyard, because I had a science project due. The look he gave me was one of pure disdain. As if I had somehow betrayed him. You think you can just skip your responsibilities to do some schoolwork? You should be more focused on the house. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't a daughter to him. I wasn't a person. I was an instrument for his convenience. I was a tool. And tools don't get to take breaks. The years passed. And I started dreaming of escape. By the time I was 16, I had already planned my exit. I had set my sights on college. I would go far away. Somewhere where no one knew me. And I would start fresh. No more Paul. No more endless cleaning. No more being invisible. It wasn't that I hated my mother. I loved her. Despite everything. She was my only family. But I didn't know how to tell her that I felt like a servant in my own home. How could I? She seemed so happy with Paul. So content in her small world. I didn't want to disrupt that for her. Besides, I told myself, it wouldn't be forever. I just had to get through high school. And then I'd be free. But life has a funny way of changing plans. When I got my acceptance letter to a college 3 states away, I thought it was my ticket to freedom. I had everything packed. Ready to go. But the night before I was supposed to leave, Paul pulled me aside. He said it was time to talk. He sat me down at the kitchen table. His voice surprisingly soft. You know, it's not easy to raise a kid, he said. I've been taking care of you all these years. You owe it to me to stay. You're not going to leave your mother alone. Are you? The guilt hit me immediately. I hadn't expected this. It wasn't the emotional blackmail I had anticipated. No, it was something worse. He was playing on my fear of being alone. He knew how much my mom depended on me. And he knew how much I loved her. In his own twisted way. He was trying to keep me there. And I stayed. I don't remember exactly when the breaking point came. It wasn't a single event. But rather a slow build-up of resentment. Every time Paul demanded something from me, I could feel the years of frustration boiling beneath the surface. My childhood had been stolen. My independence crushed under the weight of his expectations. One night, after I had just returned from a long shift at my part-time job, he asked me to make him a special dinner. I had already done the laundry, cleaned the house, and helped my mom with her work. I was exhausted. But he was never satisfied. No matter what I did. It was never enough. That night, I snapped. I told him I wasn't his maid. I told him I didn't owe him anything. And that I wasn't going to be his servant anymore. His response was calm. Almost too calm. He looked at me, his eyes cold, and said, "You'll regret this." I didn't know it then. But that moment marked the end of my childhood. It was the moment I realized I could no longer stay under his roof. And even though I didn't have a plan, even though I had no idea what the future held, I knew I had to leave. It had been years since I left that house. And in many ways, I had left everything behind. I'd put the memories of my childhood in a box and shoved it deep into the corners of my mind, convincing myself that if I never opened it again, I could live without that burden. But, of course, life has a funny way of making you face things you think you've left behind. I was living in the city now, doing something I loved, carving out a small, quiet life for myself. I had a few close friends who understood my past without needing to ask questions. And I had a job that kept me busy enough to ignore the stillness in my heart when I thought of my mom. I'd grown accustomed to the distance between us. The low hum of guilt I'd pushed down. She was happy with Paul. After all, she never seemed to notice what he had done. And I couldn't bear to tell her. So, I kept my distance. And she kept hers. But one afternoon, as I was finishing up at work, I saw my phone flash with her name on the screen. My heart sank before I even answered. The last time I'd heard from her was a brief Impersonal text on my birthday. I took a deep breath and swiped the screen. Hello. Her voice was shaky. Fragile in a way I had never heard before. I need to ask you for a favor. It's Paul. He's sick. Really sick. I don't know what to do. My stomach twisted. For a moment, I thought I might collapse. The thought of returning to that house, that place where everything had fallen apart, was enough to make my body tense up, to make my chest tighten with fear. What happened? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but failing. He's having trouble breathing, and the doctors say his condition is serious. He needs help. Someone to look after him. I can't do it by myself. I need you to come home. I felt a rush of emotions: anger, guilt, confusion, all tangled together. The very man who had stolen my youth, who had reduced me to nothing more than a servant, was now in a position where he needed my help. My mind screamed at me to say no, to stay where I was. But my heart, the part of me that still loved my mother, couldn't bring myself to turn her away. She was asking for my help. And no matter what he had done, I couldn't abandon her now. I'll come, I said, barely recognizing the words coming from my mouth. The next morning, I packed a small bag and boarded a bus back to the house I thought I'd left forever. Walking through the front door of that house again felt surreal. The smell hit me first, the same stale air, the faint scent of old furniture, and the ever-present odor of bleach from the cleaning supplies that Paul insisted on using too much of. It was exactly as I had left it. And yet, nothing had remained the same. Paul was in a recliner in the living room. The same recliner where he spent most of his days watching TV, barking orders, and treating my mom like she was his personal assistant. Only now, he looked frail, pale, and older than I remembered. His condition had clearly taken a toll on him. His once towering figure now seemed small and weak. But even in his weakness, I could see the same calculating, manipulative look in his eyes. Mom was hovering beside him, trying to appear calm. But I could see the exhaustion in her face. She hadn't changed much in the years I had been gone, except that now she looked tired in a way I had never seen before. The years of trying to keep everything together, of pretending that nothing was wrong, had worn her down. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, giving me a weak smile as I walked in. "You're the only one who can help." I wanted to tell her that I was sorry for abandoning her. Sorry for all the years of silence. But I couldn't. I just nodded and went to sit next to Paul, who barely acknowledged my presence. I'd hoped that returning would somehow feel different. But it didn't. I was back in the same role I had left behind: the maid, the caregiver, the one who had to do everything because no one else would. Paul's frailty didn't change that. If anything, it made his demands worse. Now, it wasn't just chores. Now, it was care. He wanted me to help him to the bathroom, make him meals, adjust his pillows just so. He didn't ask, he ordered. He told me I should have known what he needed before he even spoke. At first, I tried to ignore the familiar resentment bubbling inside of me. I told myself that I was here to help my mom. I was here because she needed me. But I quickly realized that nothing had changed. I was still just an object to be used. Only now, I was being used for something more intimate: his health, his aging, his decline. I wasn't just cleaning the house anymore. I was his nurse, his caretaker, his slave, and I hated it. The more I tried to push back, the more Paul pushed forward. He didn't care if I had other plans, if I was tired or stressed. He demanded what he wanted when he wanted it. And there was no room for negotiation. If I hesitated, even for a second, I would be met with his cold gaze and an accusation. "You're not being helpful," he'd say. "I'm not going to sit here and suffer because you can't be bothered." And my mother, oh. My mother. She didn't step in. She didn't tell Paul to ease up. She didn't tell him to give me space. She just let it happen. She would sit there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and say nothing. I wanted to scream at her, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I began to distance myself. I would leave the house early in the morning, claiming I had work to do, and return late at night, pretending I didn't see how much my presence was being demanded. The tension grew. I found myself snapping at Paul more often, my patience wearing thin. One evening, after he'd ordered me to clean the kitchen yet again, I lost it. "No," I said, my voice shaky with rage. "I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. Paul's face twisted in anger. "You're going to walk out on your mother," he spat. "After all I've done for you?" I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked out the door. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there a second longer. I didn't go far. I ended up sitting in my car, parked at the end of the street, watching the house. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew I couldn't stay in that place any longer. 4 years. I had allowed my stepfather to control me, to tell me who I was and what I should be. I had allowed myself to be nothing more than a servant to his needs. But that was not who I was anymore. I had grown up. I had built a life for myself, one that I could be proud of. I was not responsible for Paul's health, his well-being, or his happiness. I was not responsible for my mother's happiness either. That was a hard truth to face, but it was the truth nonetheless. I had to leave. Again. But this time, I wasn't running away. I was standing up for myself. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the house, weighing my options. The anger was still bubbling inside of me, a storm ready to break free. I wanted to scream, to throw a tantrum, to finally let everything I had been holding back for years come spilling out. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, one thought kept coming back: what would I do next? I knew I couldn't go back inside. I knew I couldn't keep playing the role I'd been given. And I couldn't keep pretending I was okay with it. I had spent so many years trying to make peace with my place in that house. But I couldn't anymore. I had grown up, moved away, and made a life of my own. And now, I had to cut the ties that had kept me shackled to a past I didn't want to be part of. The car's engine roared to life, and I pulled away from the curb. I drove aimlessly for a while, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. The anger was still there, but it had shifted. Now, it was a calm, determined kind of anger, a resolve that told me I couldn't go back to that life. I couldn't let it define me anymore. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront Paul. I had to say the words I had been too afraid to say for years. I wasn't going to stay and be his caretaker. I wasn't going to be his emotional punching bag anymore. I was done. I turned the car around and headed back to the house. When I walked in, the silence was unbearable. My mother was sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen from crying. But Paul was nowhere in sight. I didn't have to ask. I knew he was probably in his chair, waiting for me to tend to him, to cater to his every whim. But this time, I wasn't going to do it. "Mom, where's Paul?" I asked, my voice flat, no longer the timid, compliant daughter I used to be. She glanced up, her face pale and tired. He's in the bedroom. He doesn't want to see you. But he needs help. There was a desperate edge to her voice. As though she was pleading with me to continue doing what I had always done. I'm not going to help him anymore, I said. The words coming out colder than I meant them to be. I'm not doing this. Not anymore. Her face fell. The shock evident in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak. But I didn't give her the chance. Mom. I continued. My voice steadier now. I love you. But I can't do this for you. I can't keep sacrificing my life for a man who doesn't even care about me. I saw the truth in her eyes as it sank in. She didn't want to acknowledge it. But I could see it, the guilt. The realization that she had let this happen. I've been giving him everything. I've been doing everything to keep him happy, I said. Fighting the tears. But I'm not his maid. And I'm not your servant either. I'm your daughter. And I need to take care of myself. She didn't speak for a long time. There were no tears. No dramatic outbursts. She just sat there, staring at me. And for the first time in years, I saw the smallest flicker of understanding in her eyes. It wasn't much. But it was something. She knew I was right. Even if she didn't know how to fix it. I'm sorry, she whispered. Barely audible. I didn't see what was happening. I didn't know how bad it was. The words hung in the air between us. A fragile thread of honesty in a relationship that had long been built on silence and compromise. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I'm going to pack my things, I said. My heart heavy. But resolute. I'm leaving. I packed my bags slowly. Methodically. As if I were preparing for a trip I wasn't sure I could come back from. Every piece of clothing I folded felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. But every moment that passed made my chest ache with a sadness I couldn't explain. This wasn't just about leaving Paul behind. It was about leaving my mother, too. About acknowledging that I couldn't save her. No matter how much I wanted to. When I was finished, I stood at the door, looking at the house one last time. I had spent so many years here. And in those years, I had lost parts of myself that I wasn't sure I could ever reclaim. But I had to try. I had to take this step. Not just for my own future, but to preserve whatever was left of my dignity. As I opened the door, I heard my mother's voice behind me. Please don't go, she begged. Her voice raw with emotion. I don't know what I'll do without you. I turned to face her. The pain in my heart raw and unrelenting. You'll be fine, Mom, I said. My voice cracking. You have to be. I love you. But I can't keep doing this. I have to live my own life now. Her face crumpled. And for a moment, I thought she would collapse into tears. But she didn't. She just stood there. The weight of my words sinking in. The truth was, my mother had been living in a state of denial for years. She had accepted the reality of our household. The small, miserable world we had built with Paul. But now, it was time for me to move on. I turned away and walked out the door. When I left that house, I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I only knew that I couldn't stay. And I couldn't go back. I spent the next few weeks in a daze. I went back to my apartment, my small sanctuary, and tried to put the pieces of my life back together. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to explain myself. I just needed time to heal. The days passed. And slowly, the pain began to fade. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt the loneliness creep in. I missed my mom. I missed the sense of connection I had once had with her. But I knew that leaving was the right thing. She would have to figure out her own way forward. Just as I had to. It wasn't until a few months later that I heard from her again. This time, it wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a plea for me to return. It was a simple, quiet message: "I'm sorry. I finally see what you meant. I hope you're okay." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I thought about it for a while. And then, when I was ready, I sent a message back: "I'm okay. Mom. I'm really okay." And for the first time in my life, I believed it. Leaving Paul. Leaving that house. Leaving behind the burden of expectations and silent demands was the hardest thing I had ever done. But it was also the most freeing. I had spent so many years suffocating under his control, under the weight of my mother's indifference, that I forgot what it felt like to live for myself. Now, I was learning to breathe again. I was discovering who I was. Apart from the roles I had been forced into, I was creating a life on my terms. And it wasn't perfect. But it was mine. The road ahead wasn't clear. I didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, I had hope. Sometimes, when I think back on that chapter of my life, I still feel a mix of emotions. There are days when I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. What would have happened if I had kept on pretending? Kept on sacrificing? But I know now that I made the right choice. Leaving wasn't just about escaping Paul. It was about reclaiming my life. I don't know what the future holds. But I know one thing for sure. I'm no longer that girl who was too afraid to stand up for herself. I'm someone who knows her worth and is willing to fight for it. And that, in itself, is the greatest gift of all.